The problem is that they take so much time to prepare for and edit. And with all the time that I'm spending already, writing and editing for the morning report, it just feels very daunting. So I decided instead what I'm going to do is just kind of throw one together and see how it comes out in a live. And so I'm going to, this is a bit of a, I'm doing another little experiment here on you guys, and we're going to see how it works. But this is so we're going to talk a little bit about some con law stuff today. We're going to start with kind of a quick run through. We're going to dive into some of the high points of Marbury versus Madison. Then we're going to go over to the whiteboard and play around a little bit with, make sure my audio's on, right? Yeah. And play around a little bit with something that I've kind of created, which is sort of a visualized map of the U.S. Constitution that I think helps to understand some different concepts of the U.S. Constitution. And some people have seen this before because I've done these videos over the last year or so. But some of you are kind of new and may not have seen it, and certainly I've never done one live before. So I'm going to be drawing it live, which is going to be interesting, and we're going to see how that goes down. But you know what? If I want to get better at this, I got to practice, right? So let's find out how we do. So, like I said, we're going to start here. I've just been sitting here flipping through my con law book and looking a little bit through Marbury versus Madison. And most people remember the name Marbury versus Madison. Some people have a pretty good sense of why it's important, but not everybody. I don't think that by the time...
You're on the line.
Yeah. Oh. I don't think that by the time I got into law school, I remembered why it was so important. And I certainly understood it on kind of a different level once I got through law school and started to understand it a little better. I also think that a lot of the people who do understand it have a really big misconception about it that I think is something that I would like to fix. And I am willing to bet that in this, in the chat, we are going to see a few people, when I start talking about Marbury, a few people are going to mention this misconception because it was a misconception that I picked up too. I think it was a pretty widely, maybe been taught to me in class. And now after, 10, 12 years later, I've been, reading this, and my opinion has evolved a bit. So we're going to go into this. If you guys wouldn't mind tapping the screen a little bit, we'll get some shares up. We'll get some people in here, mostly because if we do end up with some people in here, which we probably will, I don't have to keep explaining where we are in the process and starting over again. It helps if we get them in early, even though it is Friday afternoon, so we'll see how many people we get in here for a constitutional law lecture. You never know. Okay. So let's talk about Marbury for a minute. We are really way back at the beginning of the Republic, soon after the Constitution's written, and things are still getting sort of figured out. One of the kind of interesting things about Marbury, it is a huge foundational case that changes a lot of stuff. And it's one of very few right at the beginning that do that. Today we think of all of these con law cases that really change the way, the Supreme Court coming in and having this huge impact. But early on, they didn't do a lot. They didn't make a lot of these big constitutional kind of declarations early on. There were just a few of them that really had this big impact, and this is one of them. But we're going to talk about it. So this is Marbury, and I'm skipping over. I could sit down and give you a nice long lecture on the actual storyline. It's a little irrelevant, but the point was, when this came up, it was still a little bit unclear exactly what the Supreme Court was supposed to be doing. The Article 3 of the Constitution is kind of vague. I mean, let's be honest, a lot of the Constitution is kind of vague. It's sort of the point. But it just kind of says, Supreme Court is, go off and judish. Go off and be judiciary. Do what you do. Judicialize things. And they don't really say a whole lot about what that means or how they're supposed to do that, or they lay out a few kind of guardrails, but they don't really explain what they're supposed to be doing. And there's been a debate ever since whether a lot of the explanation and a lot of kind of what they were supposed to be doing is implied because everybody at the time knew sort of what a judge is supposed to do, what a court is supposed to do, and so they didn't have to explain it, or whether the court just kind of came in and took over. And there is I was taught, I think, I don't know if I was exactly taught, but it was certainly what we all kind of agreed on, in our study group, and it's very widely believed that in Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court basically came in and said, this is ours now. This is what we are taking a huge chunk of what the government does, and this becomes ours today. And that is a very common belief about Marbury versus Madison, that this was not a power of the U.S. of the Supreme Court. This is not a power granted to them in the Constitution, and they came along and just seized it with Marbury versus Madison, and it's been their power ever since. And that is the power to essentially interpret the U.S. Constitution and apply federal law to it and decide whether or not it violates the Constitution. And I believed that for a very long time, and it's only kind of in my later years that I've realized that that may not be as true as I thought. Because it is sort of true, but I think that it's a little bit clear at this point that really what they're saying here is that there's no other way to interpret what they're supposed to be doing. That there is kind of, if you look at the available evidence, there is sort of no other way to twist yourself around and come up with anything else that the Supreme Court is supposed to be doing in this case, other than interpreting the Constitution and holding the federal law up against it and seeing, do these match or not? And so it wasn't really so much them grabbing any kind of power as it was them sort of acknowledging the job that they were supposed to be doing, but just wasn't quite so explicit up to that point. And one of the things that, is talked about a lot, but isn't it's a little unclear, is just how well known that was at the time because of what other judges were doing. Whether this was just kind of, some of this was already pretty obvious because of what judges in England did, and what the other judges around, when we had colonial judges, what they did, how they operated. So this has always been sort of a question, but I do think you'll hear people say that with Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court came along and just stole this power. And I just don't think it's true. But it is pretty true that before Marbury, they didn't explicitly have it. But somebody was going to have to decide whether law and whether actions of the other parts of the federal government were constitutional. And the Supreme Court really was the only group of people who were kind of in the right place to do it. And so that's really more what Marbury's about, is them kind of backing into that, and also backing into the idea that somebody does have to decide this. Because there wasn't really a specific place that said, I mean, there kind of was, but nowhere said that laws had to be constitutional. Like, it sounds really obvious, right? But this is the first place where someone said it. And so that's another really big point. So I'm just going to run through a couple of the important high points of this case, and it's, it's written in 18 early 18, let's see, 1803. So it's very flowery, very hard to read. A lot of sentences that are kind of written in the wrong order, kind of says the thing and then follows it. You want to just take the two parts of the sentence and put them backwards so they make sense. But let me just give you a couple of things that I think are important to hear out of Marbury, and we'll just cut from there. So when we're talking about the idea that that something has to be done to make sure that stuff is constitutional, there's a line here that says that those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten, the Constitution is written. Okay, again, this is one of those ones that's backwards. So what it's actually saying is, so the Constitution is written so that limits on the legislature are not forgotten. The Constitution is there to remind us that there are limits on the legislature. That's why it's written down. The distinction between a government with limited and unlimited powers is abolished. So there would be no difference between having our limited government that we want here and an unlimited power that could run roughshod over everybody if those limits did not confine people, people in the government, and acts prohibited in some way. If the Constitution didn't somehow restrict people, then what would be the point of having a Constitution, right? And as simple as this sounds, that hadn't been kind of said out loud yet. This had only been around for a couple of years. Nobody'd really tried it out. We're still people are still getting used to their seats. You know what I mean? They're still figuring out, we're still figuring out what we're going to call the president, that kind of thing. So the Constitution is either a superior paramount law or it is an ordinary legislative act, and like other acts, it can be altered when legislature feels like altering it. And so we know what the answer is. The answer is that it is a superior law. And it says it, but we have to recognize that. And an act of the legislature that is repugnant to the Constitution is void. Which, again, this sounds so obvious. Yeah, but nobody said it. So now we have that. We have that written down. They're like, so if we see something, if we see the Constitution and the legislature writes a law and it is absolutely against it, that law is now void. That law has to be void. And somebody was asking me the other day, I was talking about the Alien Enemies Act, which was the Sedition Act, which didn't allow you to print anything that was against the government. And someone asked me, like, how did they get away with that? It was, it was clearly in violation of the First Amendment. Well, nobody'd written down yet that you couldn't violate the First Amendment. Nobody figured out how to enforce that. And this is where we're just starting that idea that there is somebody whose job it is to step in and say, no, you can't write that law. That law is like clearly a violation of the First Amendment. So that's Marbury stepping up and doing that right here, right in front of our eyes. So now what they say is, okay, now who's going to do this? And they're saying, this has to be us. And the reason it has to be us is that it's the judiciary's job to look at particular cases, look at, the facts of a case and apply laws to them. And therefore, we're the ones who have to interpret the laws every time, because we got to figure out what they mean and whether or not they apply to this particular set of facts. And if we're the ones doing that, then we are the only ones who are in the position to regularly interpret this stuff. We're clearly the guys who are supposed to do this. So they said, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Those who apply the rule to particular cases must by necessity expound and interpret that rule. If two laws conflict with each other, the courts must decide on the operation of each. So we're the ones who have to decide. If there are two laws that are conflicting, we're the ones who are going to have to decide it in every case. Well, what if one of those laws is the Constitution? So we're the ones who are doing this already. And essentially, we can kind of leave it there. I think that's the biggest thing here. This is what Marbury is doing. Marbury says that we are the kind of natural people to be in this place. And there are a couple of, like I said, there's a lot of argument over the years about, exactly what happened. There was some discussion for a little while about having, because there's a veto. The president has a veto. That's kind of the president's role in the lawmaking process. And they were going to have the president and judges, the Supreme Court, work together to decide the veto, because then the Supreme Court would sort of go through and decide whether things were constitutional, and they would, that would be their part of the veto. And instead, they decided to have the president do it on its own. And the reasoning, a lot of people think, is because it was assumed that there was going to be some sort of a judicial review, that the judiciary was already going to be doing this. And I thought this was kind of funny, the mixing, who is this that said this? A guy named Luther Martin, and I love when these names, Luther Martin, said that the association of judges with the executive would be a dangerous innovation. Let's not mix the president and the judges. Let's keep these guys separate. So anyway, I think that's an interesting kind of introduction to the idea of judicial review and kind of how we end up where we are today with the Supreme Court being the ones who do this. And again, if you missed the beginning, there is this kind of common storyline that the Supreme Court sort of stole this power. But really, I think what they're doing here is recognizing that they are sort of the only ones who are just in the right place to be doing it. Because they're already the ones who are going to have to be interpreting these laws. If two laws come along, they're the ones who are going to have to decide which one stays in place. And if one of those is constitutional, they're already doing this. And so they were like, so we should be the ones that keep doing it. And ever since, they have been. So, if you guys wouldn't mind tapping and sharing and all that stuff, we'll get this going. Okay, so that's just sort of our introduction. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you guys, and some of you, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this before, I have this thing that I've developed over the years. It's a visual, it's a map that I have drawn of the U.S. Constitution. I have a theory. It is not my theory. It's based on lots of other people's theory, but so there are ideas about the Constitution. You have the actual written Constitution, and then you have all the case law and stuff. So you have lots of parts of the Constitution that are, interpretation and all that. Not exactly talking about that, but there are parts of the Constitution that are not necessarily written down exactly, but they are so inextricably linked and wrapped into this text that the Constitution can't really exist without them. And I call them constitutional architecture. They are things that are just completely built in here. They are in some ways implied. Some bits and pieces of them are explicitly written, but the whole kind of grand ideas that I'm about to get into aren't really written here. But they are kind of indisputable. And I don't think anybody disputes them. But coming up with a good way to talk about them can be really tough. And I have found that the best way to talk about them is to draw them. And so there's a lot of different parts of this, but I'm going to take you through one particular part of them. We're going to talk about federalism, separation of powers. I have two different maps. One is the regular separation of powers, and one is there's a special map just for the court system, because they had to be special. And then, just to ruin everything, we have the 14th Amendment wall and gate, that kind of make everything a little bit weird and fun. And I'm not totally 100% sure that it's a recent addition to my drawing that I'm not totally sure I've hashed out all the way, but I like it. So we'll go with it. All right, you guys ready? Here we go. So, first of all, I think I have to flip you because when I'm writing, you're not going to be able to see what I'm saying. Oh, by the way, for those of you who haven't seen this before, I came up with this idea the other day, and I cannot believe that it took me this many months to realize I have this little arm, and I could never come up with a good way to, be able to talk to you guys here and then occasionally be over at the whiteboard until I realized that, whoop, it's right there. Duh. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to flip you backwards. I think that's going to be cool. Whoop, nope. Gross. Nah! Sorry, guys. It's like where I've thrown everything to get it out of the picture before I started the live. What I want is, I think that. There we go. I think this is correct. So we're going to find out in a second if I'm doing this right. Now, up here, what I need you to do is tell me if that's correct. Is that correct? I think it looks right. That looks right. Okay. So, yep, all right. So we start out, one of the things that is super important to understanding like the base of the U.S. Constitution is that we start out as a series of colonies, and the colonies start out with their own powers. The colonies are essentially 13 little countries at the beginning, and they have their own powers, and they decide, okay, like they can absolutely control. They are completely freestanding countries, essentially, who decide, you know what, we're each going to take like this power and this power and this power. Each one of us is going to give up like those couple of powers, and we're going to bind them together into one central government, but only those powers. We're only giving those ones away. And that's going to become the federal government. But we're going to keep everything else. Everything else stays ours. And that is how we create this government. And everybody sort of signs a, I'm going to pull this up a little bit. Everybody sort of signs what I like to think of as sort of a contract. And so there's a little bit of this concept of contract law going into the U.S. Constitution. Sorry, guys, I'm still playing with this a little, trying to get it right. There is sort of an idea that we all signed on to sort of a contract, and so there's sort of this contract law idea too. But, okay, so we start out, we have our 13 colonies. So, make sure I stay in view here. Okay, so we have 13 colonies, each of which has some people in them. All right. And they all agree to set up this big federal government, and they are going to give that federal government certain powers. All right? But that federal government has to stay on its side of a line because it only is given a few powers, and it's only allowed to exercise those few powers. And so that line I like to call the wall of federalism. So we have all right, so wall of federalism. Everything up here is federal government. Everything down here is not federal government. So anything above this wall is something that the federal government can do. Anything below the wall, the federal government cannot do. Okay? And you'll sort of see, we kind of start to think of kind of two sets of walls in particular when we look at the government. And one is this horizontal federalism wall. And then within the federal government, we set up three branches. And we're going to write particularly three articles. Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, and we're going to set up these walls between those. I really don't need the third wall, but it makes me feel better. For Article 1 is the legislature, that's Congress. Article 2 is the executive, that's the president. Article 3, that is the court, the judiciary. Whoops, that's a C. And these guys are given, in Articles 1, 2, and 3, each one of them is given certain powers, and they're written in there. And these are called the enumerated powers. Enumerated, think number, as in like power number 1, power number 2, power number 3. It's a list of powers. And so they're called the enumerated powers because they're listed as though they're numbered. They're not exactly numbered, but they're still called enumerated. So the enumerated powers are the only things that each of these guys are allowed to do. So not only is the entire federal government stuck doing only the things that the entire federal government is enumerated to do, but each of these three branches is also blocked, at least originally, from doing anything that the other ones are allowed to do. So, legislative branch, only allowed to do stuff in Article 1. Executive branch, only Article 2. And Article 3 gets a little complicated, but in theory. So we have this other set of walls. So we have the one horizontal wall, and then you have the vertical walls that separate the branches. This is the separation of powers. Okay? And I'm sorry, I'm up here talking, it's a little hard to make sure I'm not missing anything too important. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of things, but I'm gonna keep rolling here. Okay, so we have the articles up here, and all of the articles are up here, 1 through 7, but I'm particularly sticking on those 3. And then you have the amendments, right? So we have, I'm going to start right here. We're going to do the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pardon? 1 sec, sorry guys. 6, 7, 8, 9, make sure I stay in here, 9, 10. Okay, so this is the Bill of Rights. Still, the articles lay out what the federal government's allowed to do. The amendments do not add any powers to the federal government. Really, they do something else. We'll talk about that in a second. But still, this federalism wall sticks. Everything up here, something the government can do. Everything down here, stuff the feds cannot do. Okay. Yeah, I don't usually give any kind of federal or any kind of, this is, more of a general explanation. Okay. Now, particularly 1 through 8 are all kind of protections. And the way I like to think of it is that the federal government up here has powers that they can execute, and these are rights. These act more like protections, especially for these individuals mostly. And so these guys execute their powers, and these all act like little shields that protect people from individual powers. But again, these are all things that the federal government cannot do. Okay? 9 and 10, we'll get to in a second. Making sure I'm not losing anything yet, because I'm just doing this off the top of my head, which is a little tougher. been a little while. Okay. So, 10. 10 is particularly interesting because 10 essentially says the same thing that this federalism wall says. Okay? 10 says that anything that is not enumerated up here belongs down here. That's it. It essentially reminds us that this federalism law exists. And so there's been this sort of big question over time. If the federal government starts to march south here and they hit this federalism wall, when they hit this wall, have they violated the Articles or violated the 10th Amendment? Do they have to cross the wall to violate the 10th Amendment? And who is allowed to sue under what theory? Do you sue under the Articles or do you sue under the 10th Amendment? And it's kind of shifted a couple of times, and I have it written down somewhere, but it's gone one way for like 50 years and then gone the other way for like 50 years. It's bounced back and forth a couple of times. But the reason that most lawyers don't use the 10th Amendment is there are just huge periods of time where the Supreme Court just doesn't like using it. They just rely on you violated the Articles. You went outside of your enumerated powers, and you're not allowed to do that. And so that is the violation, and they just don't love the 10th Amendment. Now, they started bringing it back a little bit, I want to say 80s, 90s, and they started to for a bit, and then it didn't quite catch on, so you just never know. And as a lawyer, it's like, screw it. They're not going to listen anyway. So the 10th Amendment is there, but it's a little hard to work with, especially because it kind of is there sort of twice. But there is something really interesting here, because one of the things that it says is that the 10th Amendment, anything not listed in the Articles is reserved to the states or the people. And I got really, really annoyed one day because I was like, okay, the states or the people, what do you mean? Because everything I could find was all about how powers are reserved to the states. Powers, as a general rule, are never something, in this context, are not something that usually is discussed as something that a person does. Rights are usually something that a person has. It's a shield that they hold up. A power is usually something that the government uses against. I always think of a lightning bolt coming down and the shield held up as a right and a power. And if you want to get into philosophy, there's a whole other conversation about that, but just in the sense of this conversation, the words make more sense to me that way. So I was like, okay, so why would you even mention the people if all you're going to talk about are these powers that really only belong to state or federal governments? What are we talking about? And I found it. I finally found the answer, and it's kind of a cool story. There was a case where I'm gonna say it was the 80s, maybe 90s, and there was a bunch of low-grade radioactive waste. So we're not talking about, glow-in-the-dark, used material or anything like that. It was more like garbage, used radioactive suits that needed to get thrown away, but they couldn't throw them away in a regular garbage dump because they'd been near radiation. Like, it was low-grade stuff, but it still needed some sort of protection. But every state was required to deal with it themselves. And every state had like a little bit of it to deal with. And nobody wanted to, isn't that where Homer Simpson lived? Yes, exactly. And nobody wanted it in their backyard. Go figure. So every single state is trying to find a place to bury this stuff. And all of these politicians have to agree on a spot. But nobody wants to pick a spot because all the politicians are going to lose their jobs. Because nobody's going to reelect them if they start burying nuclear waste in their backyard, right? So the politicians, the state-level politicians, these guys come up with an idea. They go to the federal government and they say, hey guys, we're in a pickle here. Could you please write a law that says that we have to pick a spot and make it very specific, like force our hands somehow, so that we don't have to be the bad guys. And the federal government was like, sure, no problem. And so they wrote a law that somehow forced them to pick a spot, and they laid out what the spot would be like, and whatever. They took the decision-making power away from these federal or from these state regulators, so that they didn't have to make this unpopular decision. And the Supreme Court said, absolutely not. That would be a violation of federalism, because the federal government is not allowed to order a state to impose federal law, to do that. So, and the states were like, yeah, but like we asked them to do it. Like, can you be cool? Like, we were totally on board with this. And Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote this response. Hey, Harambe wrote this response and said, it doesn't matter, because you are not allowed to give away federalism. Federalism does not belong to you. Federalism doesn't belong to the states. It doesn't belong to the state government. It doesn't belong to state legislatures. It belongs to the states and the people, but that's really there to protect the people, not the states. And so you're not allowed to waive federalism. You're not allowed to waive these protections. Only the people are allowed to waive federalism. And so absolutely not. You are not allowed to do that. And so they overruled that, and they said, no, you can't. That's not allowed to happen. So that is what is meant in the 10th Amendment when they say that it's reserved to states or the people, is that these rights are there for the protection of people, not these state governments. And part of this goes back to the idea that when we first set these things up, when we first signed this contract, even though, the state sent delegates to sign this, they signed it on behalf of the people that lived in their states. So this is a contract between all of these people, not between these state governments. And so that is kind of the underlying concept of federalism and this 10th Amendment. Now, we're going to talk 9th Amendment for a second. Actually, yeah, we'll talk 9th Amendment for a second. And then I'll swing back around to Article 3. Kind of flying through this faster than I meant to, but... So 9th Amendment, I have to read it because I always forget, is really interesting because every time you hear somebody say that, oh, that's not a constitutional right because it's not written in the Constitution, point them to the 9th Amendment. The 9th Amendment says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, specifically, at that point, it's 1 through 8, really. So the enumeration of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others that are retained by the people. In other words, this list is not the end of the list. There are more here that are not written down. And so when we talk about things like privacy rights that are implied in the Constitution, they will often, point to other spots in here where they will say, well, this is kind of implied by part of the 8th Amendment, part of the 5th Amendment, part of, whatever. But it's also rooted in that 9th Amendment requirement that nothing is allowed to say, oh, that's not listed there, and therefore it doesn't exist. The 9th Amendment says that, dispositively, just because something's not listed here does not mean it doesn't exist. Now the problem is, flipping that backwards, the 9th Amendment can't imply that everything is there, right? And so figuring out where that list ends, it's a little tougher. It's more of a response to someone saying, no, that can't be here because it's not listed, than it is to someone saying that has to be here because of the 9th Amendment. Oh, thank you. So that is sort of the weakness of the 9th Amendment. But I want to give you guys an example. There is, I can't remember the case name, it's a really super famous case, and it is Griswold, I think, Griswold v. Connecticut, which creates Griswold, I think it's Griswold, I hope it's Griswold, otherwise I'm going to be embarrassed later, creates this whole line of cases that gives rise to so much of our modern case law. And the idea of Griswold, it was, with these cases, they usually look for a case where it's a really clean story, a very clean, easy to deal with story. And in this case, what we were dealing with was a married couple in 1968, 70, something like that, who for some reason wanted to go on birth control. And the question, I think Connecticut had a law against it. And so the question was, did they have a right to privacy? If their doctor had agreed to put them on it? And it's important that they were married, because at the time there was a discussion that, this shouldn't be allowed for people who aren't married. But so that took that part of the discussion away. So that part's not going to be discussed. So if this is a married couple, so we've taken that part of the conversation out, who just either they don't want to have children, or they already have 3 and they don't want to have a 4th, something. But their doctor has prescribed them this, and the state of Connecticut won't allow it. And the question was, can the state of Connecticut do that? And the Supreme Court said, no, the state of Connecticut cannot. And the reason that the state of Connecticut did it was unfortunately not because of the 9th Amendment. I keep going in the wrong direction. Was unfortunately not because of the 9th Amendment. Instead, and I think that one of the concurring opinions went with the 9th Amendment, but instead they went with this other discussion. And that has created problems for us for decades. The justice who wrote this came up with this idea of the penumbras of the Constitution, the penumbras of the amendments. And what the justice said is that these other amendments, so many of these other amendments suggest the idea of privacy. The 8th Amendment, the 5th Amendment, the 3rd Amendment even, they have this suggestion implied in them that Americans deserve privacy, that privacy is at the core of constitutionalism, that there's no way to read all of these and not get this general idea that privacy is implied by the Constitution. And so, even though we're not going to point anywhere specific and say, this comes from here, we're going to say that generally there is this kind of thing, there's this general idea of privacy that comes out of here somewhere. And that case became the sort of foundation for a lot of cases afterwards. So Roe v. Wade and I think Dobbs, a lot of these cases relied on this penumbra argument. And it has been argued ever since that if instead of going with the penumbra argument, they'd just gone with the 9th Amendment, none of the problems that we've had since would have happened. If we'd just gone a little more clearly and said, hey, the 9th Amendment says, it would have been way clearer. But they didn't. They went with this penumbras argument that was really abstract and fluffy, and was way easier later to be like, penumbras? Are you kidding me? What are you talking? What is penumbras? What's going on? And so it just wasn't as strong. Didn't Alito say if the right is not listed in the Constitution, it can be taken away? I believe so, which is explicitly contrary to the 9th Amendment. But the reason is that no one's ever taken this 9th Amendment argument. If they had relied on this 9th Amendment argument and used it in case law, then he wouldn't have a leg to stand on there. So, so it created this whole house of cards that kind of made the whole thing collapse. And it's been an argument for years. Even I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to say that, the big problem with Roe was that it was built on that instead of on the Ninth Amendment. And how do I spell penumbras? Penumbra. And I'm trying to remember it. It sounds like umbrella, and the word, it means something very similar, and I can't think of the word. Does loving rely on it? I thought loving had its own. Well, maybe it does. But yeah, it's there's so much that fits into this, and so it really brought down a lot. There's a lot that relied on this penumbras discussion. So I'm not sure whether they specifically overturned Griswold, but that part of the argument is definitely part of how Roe came down, is that it just was rooted in this implied, kind of fluffy idea of these, yeah, I guess, there's sort of a right-ish kind of in here somewhere, and we're gonna base, 8 major Supreme Court cases on that. Like, eventually, it was a pretty easy one to knock down. So, yeah, we'll get into the details later. It'll be fine. And so I really do think, and it's been a little while since I've read it, but I do believe that even at the time, one of the concurring opinions called on the 9th. And so, yeah, if they just relied on the 9th, it would have been a lot stronger. But relied on the 14th. That makes more sense. I thought, yeah. So, okay. That's the 9th, 10th. The other guys, remember, federalism is huge. Everything above the wall can do. Everything below the wall you can't do. Now let's talk for 1 second about, we're going to hit the 14th in a minute, but first I just want to tell you about Article 3 real fast. Because Article 3 screws up my lovely, it would be really nice if Article 1, stuck to the legislature, Article 2 stuck to the executive, and Article 3 stuck to the judiciary. Unfortunately, Article 3 only gives us a Supreme Court in the judiciary branch. That's all it does in Article 3. And then it says in Article 3, and if we need any other courts, Congress can deal with that. Why? Why didn't they just say that this branch can handle their own lower courts? I don't know. I think that when all this is being considered, we had just moved. This wasn't our first government. I don't know. I think a lot of people know that, but this wasn't our first shot at a government or a constitution. When we finished the war, and we set up our first government under the Articles of Confederation, and they sucked. They were terrible. We learned a lot from them. We knew what we didn't want after that, but they were really bad. And one of the things that we had there was no executive branch and no judiciary branch. All we had was a legislature. And that does not work great because, they make laws all day and then nobody can do anything. Nobody does anything with them. And if there's any kind of conflict, nobody's there to figure it out. And so that was one of the things that kept happening is these different states started fighting with each other and nobody was there to figure out who was right and who was wrong. And so after about 15 years or so, we were like, okay, this has got to go. We need a new one. But the idea that the legislature was, even if they weren't going to be the only branch, that they were going to be the most important branch, did not go away. The legislature remained very, very much the center of the new government. And if you read the Articles of Confederation and then you read Article 1, they're very, very similar. Almost identical. Like huge chunks of them are very, very similar. And so even though there are other branches created, the legislature is definitely, I think, imagined to be kind of the main branch that's doing pretty much everything. They've just added these 2 other branches to help out a little bit, more than really be as big of a deal as the legislature. So I think that's why, even though they created a Supreme Court, they were like, well, we may not need, it'd be nice to have a court, but we don't necessarily need like a bunch of courts. But if we do, like, we'll let Congress set some up. So that means that all of our circuit courts, all of our district courts, all of that stuff is all set up by Congress. That means that Congress has a lot of power over the lower courts. They don't have that same power over the Supreme Court, but they do have that power over the lower courts. And that's why what happened, if anybody knows anything about this CASA case that happened earlier this summer, when they really restricted the power of the lower courts, they really have the power to do that because they can just close the lower courts if they want. They're the ones who fund them. So if they decide, we're closing all the lower courts tomorrow, that's it. Congress can do that. So that is the thing about, even though these are generally split into these three groups, the third branch is really only the Supreme Court, and the rest of it down here is we call them Article 3 courts because they are written in Article 3, but they are funded and they are controlled by Congress out of Article 1. Now, there's one other group of courts, and these are called Article 1 courts, because Congress sometimes makes up their own courts that have nothing to do with Article 3. They're not part of this whole system. Sometimes Congress just sets up like special courts deal with some smaller issues, and those are called Article 1 courts. And they're made by, they'll write a special law that's like, hey, we're going to set up this little like smaller judiciary that's going to deal with certain questions. And I hesitate to mention them because I always screw up which is which. I want to say things like tax courts. I don't think that's right, and that's why I'm hesitant to even say. I always get it wrong. But there are these Article 1 courts that are different. And the biggest difference between the Article 3 courts and the Article 1 courts is that Article 3 says that judges will be appointed for life and can never have their salaries reduced. And so even though these other district court and circuit court judges are created by Congress, if they are set up under Article 1 as part of this system, Article 3 judges can never be dismissed and can never have their salaries reduced. Article 1 courts, they can have their salaries reduced. They're kind of courts light. I was trying to think. Bankruptcy courts, I think, are Article 3 courts. It really is something a little bit more specific. They're more like tribunals kind of thing. I just don't want to say it. If I'd thought ahead, I would have looked it up and made sure I had an answer. Immigration courts. There we go. Immigration courts are Article 1 courts. There we go. Thank you. And so they're allowed to be fired, and they're allowed to have their salaries reduced because they're not totally courts. So that's the deal. Okay, so that is all of that. But can you sort of see, and I just kind of threw this together, it's a lot nicer when I take my time and I draw it real pretty, but this is what I think of when I think of what the Constitution looks like to me. This is what I think of. I think of the articles up here, the amendments over here, the big federalism wall here, the big walls separating the separation of powers up here. I don't know why I always put the states over here, but I think that they're important to have down here under the cannot do thing, okay? And then I'm going to add, this is a recent addition, but I'm pretty proud of it. Wait, hold on, let's see. What about courts? You were talking about some of the cases being moved. So the Court of Federal Claims is an Article 3 court. It's still an Article 3 court. It's just a special one that was set up just to hear contract claims. So still Article 3. So the last thing that I've kind of added to this, and I figured out part of it, and I figured there's another part of it, so I don't want to, that I can't remember, because it took me a while to come up with this, but is the 14th Amendment. So when this was all written, it only applied to the federal government, and that's really important because early on, the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, the First Amendment, all of this stuff was only written to restrict this government. It didn't have any impact on these guys over here. Nothing. They could, restrict your right to speech all they wanted. Now, most of these guys over here, nothing. They could, restrict your right to speech all they wanted. Now, most of the states have their own constitutions, and most of them mirrored pretty closely this constitution, so they would probably have rules that were pretty similar, but not necessarily. And so these federal laws, these federal protections here in the U.S. Constitution did not apply to the states at the beginning. And then we get the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment gives us a couple of things. It gives us due process rights in a different way, but we had due process rights under the Fifth Amendment. They just only applied to the federal government. So I created, let me see if I can remember how to draw this. Is it off screen? Okay, here we'll. Again, I made this all up, so some of it is not perfect, but I was just trying to come up with good ways to explain this stuff, and I like visuals, and so I thought teaching it through visuals would be helpful. I found a way to take it up here too, but I can't remember what it was. So for now, we're just going to ignore that. And put a little gate here. This is our 14th Amendment. So the thing about the 14th Amendment is that it requires you to go through something before. But the 14th Amendment does a couple of things, but one of the things that it does is it starts to apply some of these rules to the states. And so very slowly, some of these start to get applied. I screwed up part of my drawing, but you know what? I'm just going to pretend for now, and it'll be better next time I do it. So some of these start to get applied in little bits and pieces to the states. And the states stop being able to get what they want unless they pass through this 14th Amendment gate. And not the entire thing. It never gets brought over entirely. One case tries to apply the whole thing, but it can't. They don't allow that. It's called the slaughterhouse cases, where they try to apply the entire thing. They say the 14th Amendment says that all of these apply to the states now, and the Supreme Court says no. But then one at a time, they go through First Amendment, and they don't even go through the whole amendment. They'll be like, First Amendment, this part of the First Amendment, that part of the First Amendment, this, whatever. One little piece at a time, case by case, they start applying these to the 14th Amendment wall. And little bits and pieces, I'm just making these numbers up because I can't remember off the top of my head which do and which don't. The most recent, though, that I think a lot of people find very fascinating, the most recent addition through the 14th Amendment is the Second Amendment, which was not added until 2010. The Second Amendment did not apply to states until 2010. There's the Heller decision, which applies the First or the Second Amendment to the District of Columbia, but that's not a state. And then there's another case right after it. Yeah, I don't think the third. You're right. Sorry. And then there's another case right after it that it's something v. Chicago, City of Chicago, that applies the Second Amendment to the states. McDonald, yes, thank you. And so only now is the Second Amendment applied to the states. And the other thing we have now is this due process gate. And in order to get certain things now, in order for the states to fit through this gate and get places they want to go, they now have to open this gate. And so due process is not always the same thing. Due process is different every time, but you're always going to have to open a gate now if you want to do certain things. The government can't just take things from you. They can't just send you somewhere. They have to go through some process of some sort. They owe you a process. That process is due to you. All they got to do is open the gate, but they have to open the gate. They can't get through otherwise. Gate's closed. So I call this the due process gate. And I'm missing a step, but I can't remember what it was. So I'm just going to pretend. Okay, so this is my map so far that I've come up with of the U.S. Constitution. Oh, that's all right, Shelley. You know, I'll probably do it again. I'm still, you know, practicing. I'm trying to get better at it. So has the 9th been through? Yes, I did the 9th already. I have a video on the 9th too, so you guys can watch that as well. But this is... So here's the thing about this. Most of these things that I'm talking about here aren't written in the Constitution. Federalism, it doesn't say federalism anywhere. But if you read the articles and read the fact that, you know, that this is a limited government and that the powers are limited to what's written in the articles, that's very clear. And the 10th Amendment says that if a power is not listed, it doesn't belong to the federal government. That's clear. So this federalism wall is very clearly implied by the Constitution. It just doesn't say it anywhere. And so there's a lot of these things that I think of as architecture. And so I think the idea of drawing it, of turning it into a map, just makes sense. And so there's just kind of a lot of these different things, and you'll see a lot of, it's very common for law students to think this idea of federalism and separation of powers generally being shaped like that is pretty common. I just like to add some fun to it because I think it makes it a little cooler. But generally, this is my map of the U.S. Constitution. Whoop. And it just makes the whole thing make a little bit more sense to me. And I also kind of, I don't know, just kind of makes it feel a little more real. So, okay. I'm going to come back over here, if you don't mind, because that was a lot. All right. Do you guys have any questions? I can go back over there if I need to show you something, but... that is... Whew! I've done that, I've broken that up into probably four or five different videos before, but I don't think I've ever done it straight through like that. So that was a lot. Plus, it was just kind of off the top of my head. But yeah, please let me know. Are there any questions? How do you guys feel about? Does this make sense to you? How much of this is new? Is any of this new? The idea of federalism new? I think that this is really important stuff right now as we see. Oh, good. Okay, these videos are how I found you. Yeah, I mean, you know, they were kind of how I started, and I really do like doing them. It's just, it really does take a lot of work. Coming up with coming up with those drawings takes a long time because I have to come up with something, and then I kind of come up with all the reasons that it's wrong and keep fixing it and fixing it and fixing it until I find one that doesn't have any holes in it. So a lot is new. Okay, good. All right. I'm glad to hear that it's new stuff. But it's you know, it takes a while. I wish I could remember. There was something about the 14th Amendment wall that I forgot, and I can't remember what it was. I'm gonna have to. I never did the video on the 14th Amendment wall. I got it ready, and then I just never got to it. So, you know, I'm very much a visual or more tactile. Like I like to interact with things, and so having something I can interact with really makes it easier for me. Yeah, just trying to get you out in high school. But this is also, you know, as a constitutional lawyer, this is what we need. You know, this is really high level stuff. You know, I don't mean to suggest that it's not, I've actually been reading, where are you? Somewhere here. There's a book by Lawrence Tribe called The Invisible Constitution, and it's really a lot of what he goes into is this kind of, these implied things, this constitutional architecture, things like that, that are things that you can't kind of deny, but also that aren't explicit anywhere. And I think that they're very important and sometimes overlooked. But particularly, you know, that the idea of federalism is just so key and so frequently overlooked. Yeah, the idea of having a different government first, even people who understand the Articles of Confederation don't necessarily think of it that way, and it is absolutely a separate government. In fact, the rules of changing the Articles of Confederation, because the Articles of Confederation had like a thing in it that said, okay, if we want to amend this or replace it or whatever, this is how we do it. They didn't even bother. They did not follow those rules. They basically just, they never closed the Articles of Confederation. They just started a new country, completely new country. So in theory, that country is still open. Not really, but if you wanted to say it, you probably wouldn't totally be wrong. So it was very much a different country. But what's really fun is I've made a chart before where I kind of laid out one for one each section, section for section, the Articles of Confederation next to the Constitution, and just kind of look at how similar they are. The concept of a states' right case, that's just federalism. A states' rights case is when when the federal government starts to sneak past that wall, that federalism wall, when they start to head too far south, they are only allowed to exercise the rights that are listed in their set of enumerated rights. And if they start to exercise rights that aren't listed there, then they are moving beyond, they're crossing out of federalism. And that's when you have a problem. That's a states' rights case. And you got to remember that at the beginning, these were 13 different countries. And they all agreed, all right, we are going to give up this right, this one right, and this one right, and this one right. But that's it. That's all we're giving up. The rest of this is ours. And so the rest of it remains theirs. It still does. If you could provide a conflict of interest of a state Supreme Court for ruling on a... there's going to be another half. And so, one of the things that we are going to talk about, there was a point, there is a case early on, it's not Hunter's lessee? I always mix it up with Humphrey's, it's right here, I just saw it. I think it's Hunter's lessee, which was the first case where the Supreme Court kind of clashed with a state Supreme Court. It was after the Revolutionary War. State constitutional provision, can it be heard by the Supreme Court? So it kind of depends. So can the federal Supreme Court hear a question of state constitutional law? Very rarely would they. It would have to really be, because not only, when I say that the federal government got only these powers, that includes the courts. The courts are limited in their jurisdiction. They only get to hear certain types of cases. And so it has to be one of the cases that they're allowed to hear. And so, but in the right situation, they would be able to. I'm trying to think of Martin versus Hunter's lessee. That was, so right after the Revolutionary War, there was a guy in Virginia. There was an English person who wanted their land back that they'd owned in Virginia. And Virginia had given it away. And the Virginia Supreme Court said, yeah, we gave that away. But the federal government had agreed to give it back. And at the end, the federal government won out. because the federal government's right to sign treaties was one of those powers that the states gave away. So, yeah, I'm trying to think, like, for example, if there was a question of something in a state constitution violating the federal constitution, that could probably go before it. It's rare. It's rare for a question of state constitutionality to go before the federal court. They would really not want to do that. But if it were just right, they might. I just can't think of the exact layout. So, yeah. And I think as a general rule, it would violate. Yeah, it's outside of their wheelhouse. But you're going to hear. So there's a lot of this stuff when you hear what we've been talking a lot about related to use of the use of the military to enforce federal law. There's a little bit of federalism stuff in there, but not. But it's back and forth. That's the question, because there are some things that are listed in there as powers they can do, and some things that are a little bit confusing. Some of it's really confusing. Some of it's not very clear. So that's part of the question is, when we talk about rules of federalism and these questions of federalism, this is what we're talking about. Is this something that was explicitly written in there? And when you read it, what does it mean? Because sometimes it's not clear. And figuring that out is... that's a job for somebody in a black robe to work out. So let's see here. Did I hit? Yeah. And do we have any other questions? Anything else strike you guys? I'm sweaty. That was a lot. Kind of excited though. Although I got through. Now I've got to come. Hey, thank you. I'm still in my Aloha Friday gear. I love this shirt. The only problem is that I'm gonna want to do that particular one again, because it's one of my favorites, and that was kind of like 3 of my different videos all in a row. Plus, I want to practice it more, so you're probably gonna hear that again sometime. Well, okay, good that you're trying to digest. That's good, because if I have to do it again, you can tell me if I got it wrong. And I'll try to add some more background to it. There are a couple of things that I probably would fix up. All right, guys. Well, I think I'm going to wrap up then, because I'm going to take a little rest. Go get some water. But thank you all for stopping by, and have a wonderful afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your Friday. I might be back later. We'll see. But all right, bye everybody.